The landscape has completely shifted just 33 days ahead of the election, as Lee Jae-myung, the Democratic Party's leading presidential candidate, moves from a position of innocence to one of virtual guilt. Now, the only legal judgment left is whether the fine exceeds the 1 million won threshold to qualify for running in the election or not. Let's dive into the details with reporter Woo Chong-hwan. So, reporter Woo, since the Supreme Court has effectively ruled guilty today, does this mean that Lee Jae-myung is still eligible to run for the presidency or not?
Currently, the Supreme Court has decided to send the case back for a retrial at the Seoul High Court, meaning that this ruling is still provisional and not final. Lee Jae-myung of the Democratic Party of Korea remains eligible to run, as disqualification applies only if a fine over 1 million won for violating the Public Official Election Act is finalized.
All right, so Lee Jae-myung can run for the presidency. But if the Seoul High Court holds a retrial, is there a chance the ruling could differ from the Supreme Court's directive and turn out not guilty?
At this point in time, that outcome seems highly unlikely. That's because legal frameworks like the Court Organization Act and Civil Procedure Act mandate lower courts to follow the decisions of higher courts. Also, based on previous Supreme Court precedents, unless new evidence emerges that wasn't presented in the earlier trial, the retrial must generally align with the higher court's judgment. In other words, the upcoming retrial will confirm Lee's guilt, focusing only on determining the level of penalty.
With guilt effectively confirmed and only sentencing pending, 33 days remain until the election. Can the final ruling be delivered before then?
It's not impossible, according to some predictions. There are speculations that Lee might delay the process by avoiding attendance or prolonging delivery procedures. However, he might also choose to attend the trial to counter allegations of delaying tactics. Even if he doesn't appear, trials under the Public Official Election Act can proceed in his absence. Legal experts suggest that if the retrial panel is committed, the process could be expedited with just 1 or 2 sessions, potentially concluding before the election. However, even if the ruling comes before the election, the higher appeal to the Supreme Court would still remain, meaning this retrial decision wouldn't be final either.
In short, it's essentially a guilty verdict, but the final ruling likely won't be handed down before the election. The key question is if Lee Jae-myung's trial can proceed if elected, if court proceedings continue after he becomes president. Article 84 of the Constitution addresses this. The Supreme Court didn't rule on it this time.
The term prosecution in non-prosecution privilege questions if ongoing trials fall within its scope. Expectations were high that the Supreme Court's full bench would decisively rule on this today, yet no decision was delivered.
So without a ruling on this, if Lee Jae-myung becomes president, will the trials continue or not?
The decision regarding this matter, at the outset, will be determined by the appellate court that is responsible for handling the retrial process. In a similar vein, there are additional legal proceedings that this candidate is presently contending with. This includes the first trial on the Daejang-dong allegations, the first trial on North Korea remittance charges, and the second trial on perjury charges. The respective courts will be responsible for making the decision on whether or not to proceed with these trials. A former High Court judge, who speculated on the possibility of a retrial being overturned in today's ruling, told MBN that if Lee Jae-myung becomes president, there's a high chance the court might halt the trial.
If trials pause once he's president, won't candidates from the People Power Party and other opposing parties object? If there's more pushback, shouldn't we let the Constitutional Court decide again?
That's right. If the court decides to stop the trial of this candidate, a party like the People Power Party would surely protest. Conversely, if the trial continues, the Democratic Party would likely object. Ultimately, either way, it's likely to lead to a constitutional appeal to get a ruling from the Constitutional Court. Even if this candidate becomes president, the question of whether the trial can continue would go to the Constitutional Court.
Currently, the political climate needs assumptions. Let's explore another scenario. If candidate Lee Jae-myung runs for president, wins the election, and is then convicted with a fine exceeding 1 million won, which would result in losing eligibility, does he retain the presidency or is it terminated?
This situation is really rather ambiguous, as I think many people might have noticed. If National Assembly members are found guilty of violating election law with fines over 1 million won or any law resulting in imprisonment, they immediately lose their position. According to the Public Official Election Act, If a winner's eligibility is lost before their term starts, their election is invalidated. However, the National Assembly Act states that if a member of the National Assembly is confirmed to have lost their eligibility to be elected, they immediately lose their seat. But for the President, there's no specific law stating they lose their position if their eligibility is revoked during their term.
Only National Assembly members lose their positions. No law states the President must resign. Meaning that even if the President is fined over 1 million won during their term, they retain their position. Is that correct?
While we need to obtain an accurate legal interpretation, that is precisely what the written law currently suggests. According to the current Constitution, the President can only lose their position through impeachment proceedings and a ruling from the Constitutional Court. Even if a sitting President is found guilty of insurrection, which isn't covered by presidential immunity, there's no law that says they immediately lose their position. They still have to go through the impeachment process separately.
So like former President Park Geun-hye and former President Yoon Suk-yeol, the National Assembly must pass impeachment for the President to step down. We've also speculated on various scenarios where the President might lose office this time. Today, the Supreme Court's full bench ruling was 10-2. Interestingly, the decision was split exactly based on which President appointed whom.
That's right. Today's Supreme Court en banc decision involved Chief Justice Cho Hee-dae and 11 other justices, making a total of 12 participants. But the Chief Justice Cho and the 9 justices who found this candidate guilty were appointed by former President Yoon Suk-yeol. The dissenting opinions from Justices Lee Hung-gu and Oh Kyung-mi were appointed by former President Moon Jae-in. There were talks on whether the Constitutional Court judges' makeup, who handled former President Yoon's impeachment, might affect the trial. This ruling shows how outcomes vary based on which president appointed the justices.
So the conclusion was a 10-2 split based on the judges' inclinations. Thank you for the explanation. That was reporter Woo Chong-hwan.